Welcome to The Explainer. Have you ever looked up at the night sky, or maybe just stared at a really intricate leaf and wondered, how exactly did all of this get here? Well, today we're going to dive straight into a fascinating philosophical concept known as the design argument. We're going to map out exactly how this argument is structured from our source material, look at the physical evidence, check out some ancient texts, and explore this massive divide between some of history's most brilliant minds. Let's get into it. Okay, here's our quick roadmap for today. First, we'll define the argument itself. Second, we'll look at the evidence for functional complexity. Third, we'll break down the skeptic and theist divide. And fourth, we'll look at the proposed characteristics of the creator.
Starting off with Section 1, defining the design argument and really understanding its core premise.
So to really grasp this, we first have to understand what this argument isn't. You might have heard of the cosmological argument. That one basically looks at the mere existence of raw material, like a lump of clay, and asks, hey, what is the origin of this? But the design argument takes a totally different approach. It specifically observes what our source calls functional complexity. So if the cosmological argument says, here's a blank canvas, where did it come from? The design argument says, wow, look at this incredibly beautiful painting. Who painted it? And at the absolute heart of all this is that term, functional complexity. The source defines this as complex arrangements within the material world that proceed with specific functions, order, and intended purpose. Basically, when we see a functioning system leading toward a specific result, our human brains naturally just assume a designer intentionally programmed that system.
Think about it like this. A pile of lumber and nails doesn't just magically build itself into a house, right? A builder has to literally inject information and effort into the system, turning raw wood into a functioning home with a roof that keeps the rain out. Or take a musician. Raw sound vibrations are everywhere, often just as random, annoying noise. But a musician purposefully takes those haphazard sound waves and arranges them into a gorgeous, orderly melody. That leap from raw material to an ordered arrangement is the entire essence of the design argument.
Moving on to Section 2, evidence of functional complexity. Looking at observations in both nature and text. The source points to 4 really concrete natural observations to back this whole thing up. First up, Earth's finely tuned systems. Think about our magnetic field and water cycles working in perfect, constant concert. Second, the fundamental forces of nature. Gravity and electromagnetism operate on wildly different scales, yet they integrate perfectly to hold matter together. Third, the highly functional, orderly arrangement of the periodic table. And fourth, this one is mind-blowing, the staggering amount of information packed inside something as tiny as a dandelion seed. It's literally a complete blueprint for life, just sitting right there in your backyard.
Now, the argument also leans heavily on scriptural evidence, showing how ancient writers identified this exact same complexity thousands of years ago. Genesis 1, for example, doesn't just describe the creation of stars, it explicitly states they were placed purposefully for seasons and years. Psalm 139 describes the human body as being fearfully and wonderfully made. Job 38 points to specific ordinances in the heavens, and Isaiah 45 declares the earth wasn't created in vain, but specifically to be inhabited. You see, the emphasis across the board here is always on purpose, not just random existence.
All right, let's look at Section 3, the skeptic and theist divide, and how different minds interpret this exact same evidence. Historically, you've got ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle who observed this exact same data without any modern microscopes or scientific equipment. Yet they concluded that nature exhibited what they called final causes. They saw that every creature seemed perfectly designed to fit into its specific, unique place in the grand scheme of the ecosystem. But here is where it gets really fascinating. Modern skeptics actually agree on the visual evidence itself. Science writer Michael Shermer notes that the design inference comes naturally simply because the world objectively looks designed. Not to be clear, Shermer does not proclaim a belief in God. He views this merely as an appearance of design. But he fully acknowledges that our brains are practically hardwired to perceive it this way because of how flawlessly the universe operates. And this exact same sentiment is echoed by evolutionary biologist and famous atheist Richard Dawkins. He openly acknowledges that biological life functions so ingeniously, it gives the appearance of having been designed by a highly sophisticated physicist or engineer. So the visual data, not really up for debate. The divide is strictly over what actually caused it. Which brings us to Stephen Hawking's ultimate dilemma. He asks whether the universe's beginnings were chosen by God or if they were determined by a law of science. Hawking chalks up this profound physical order entirely to the unthinking laws of science. He essentially noted that if you want to call those laws God, you totally can, but it wouldn't be a personal creator answering your prayers. But then, in sharp, direct contrast, we have Isaac Newton. Newton looked at the exact same laws of gravity that Hawking referenced, but Newton concluded that the laws themselves couldn't possibly explain the origin of the design. A law of gravity explains how planets move, sure, but not why they're in such a beautifully functioning system to begin with. For Newton, a law absolutely logically required a lawgiver.
Finally, Section 4. Characteristics of the creator and the deductions the source makes from this design.
If we follow this argument to its logical, theistic conclusion, the source actually deduces some very specific traits about this proposed designer. First off, functioning processes in constant motion imply a prime mover to kickstart it all. Second, a universe operating on strict mathematical laws implies a highly logical mind. Third, all that microscopic, flawless data inside a grain of pollen? That implies an omniscient or all-knowing designer. Fourth, the massive sheer power behind gravity and electromagnetism points to an omnipotent being. And lastly, because we live in a finely tuned ecosystem meant to thrive, the argument deduces a personal and concerned creator who specifically engineered it for our benefit.
So to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. If even the greatest modern skeptics admit that the laws of nature flawlessly mimic the work of an ingenious architect, what does this functional complexity reveal to you about our origin? When you look at the gravity holding you in your seat right now, or the incredible information in the trees outside your window, where does the evidence logically point you to explore next? Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this source material. Keep questioning, keep observing, and we will catch you next time.